Margaret Chen had worked at the Riverside Public Library for 15 years, and in all that time, she had never raised her voice above a whisper. Patrons knew her as the quiet woman behind the reference desk, who could find any book, answer any question, and solve any research problem with methodical precision. But when the new library director decided to digitize old personnel files, something caught his attention. As he scanned Margaret's employment application from 2009, he noticed a line that made no sense. Previous employer, Educational Resources International. A quick Google search revealed that Educational Resources International didn't exist. But to anyone with security clearance, those three words meant something entirely different. Welcome to Real Heroes Stories YT. Before we continue this fascinating story of hidden identities and quiet strength, tell me in the comments, from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in the most ordinary places. The Riverside Public Library occupied a stately brick building on Elm Street, built in 1952, when communities still believed that libraries were the heart of civic life. 3 floors of books, periodicals, and quiet study spaces served a population that had grown from 15,000 to nearly 40,000 over the decades, but the library's mission remained unchanged: to provide information, education, and sanctuary to anyone who walked through its doors. Margaret Chen understood sanctuary. She had built her post-government life around it. At 52, Margaret moved through the library with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of being helpful without drawing attention. She wore simple cardigans in muted colors, kept her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and spoke in tones so soft that patrons often had to lean forward to hear her. Her desk at the reference section was organized with military precision. Pens in their designated holders, reference materials arranged by frequency of use, computer screen angled to prevent casual observation. Most patrons saw exactly what Margaret wanted them to see: a dedicated librarian who happened to be exceptionally good at her job. What they didn't see were the habits that no amount of civilian life could completely erase. The way she positioned herself to observe all entrances, the way she memorized the faces of regular visitors, the way she could assess a person's background, education level, and potential threat status within 30 seconds of conversation. Margaret Chen hadn't always been a librarian, but Margaret Chen had always been very good at gathering information. The transition to digital personnel files began on a Monday morning in September. David Kim, the new library director hired 3 months earlier, had ambitious plans for modernizing the institution. Fresh out of graduate school with an MLS from Syracuse and ideas about transforming public libraries into community innovation hubs, David approached his job with the enthusiasm of someone who had never worked in government bureaucracy. "We need to scan all employee records going back 20 years, David announced during the monthly staff meeting. "Everything needs to be digitized, backed up, and made searchable. I know it's tedious work, but it's essential for compliance and efficiency." Margaret listened from her seat in the back row, her expression betraying nothing. But inside, something tightened. Personnel files contained information she had carefully crafted 15 years ago, information designed to be believable but unremarkable. Information that wouldn't stand up to the kind of scrutiny that digital databases made possible. After the meeting, Margaret approached David's office. "About the file digitization project," she said in her characteristic whisper. "I'd be happy to help with the scanning. I have experience with document preservation." David looked up from his computer, grateful for the assistance. Margaret was one of his most reliable employees, the kind of person who anticipated problems and solved them before they became crises. That would be wonderful, Margaret. I was worried about the time commitment, but if you're willing to help, we could probably finish everything in a few weeks. Margaret nodded. I can start with the older files. Sometimes the paper quality from the 1990s and early 2000s requires special handling. What she didn't mention was that she particularly wanted to handle her own file personally, to ensure that certain inconsistencies remained buried in the analog past. Margaret began the scanning project the following Wednesday, working in the basement archives after normal library hours. The personnel files were stored in metal cabinets that smelled of old paper and bureaucratic permanence. She worked methodically through the alphabetical arrangement. Adams, Brown, Carter, each file containing the standard employment documents, reference letters, and background check summaries that comprised the paper trail of working life. When she reached her own file, Margaret paused. She hadn't looked at these documents in 15 years, hadn't needed to remember the carefully constructed narrative that had transformed her from someone she could never discuss into someone unremarkable enough for public employment. Margaret's file was thicker than most, but not suspiciously so. Her employment application from 2009 was professionally typed, listing previous experience in information management and research services. Her references came from colleagues at Educational Resources International, a consulting firm that specialized in curriculum development for international schools. Her background check showed clean credit, no criminal history, and verification of her master's degree in Library and Information Science from the University of Washington. Everything was perfectly normal, perfectly believable, and perfectly fabricated. Educational Resources International had been a CIA front company, one of dozens of legitimate-seeming businesses that provided cover for intelligence officers working overseas. Margaret's colleagues at ERI had been fellow case officers, and her work in curriculum development had involved gathering intelligence on foreign education systems, identifying potential assets among international students, and maintaining safe houses in countries where Americans asking too many questions might face serious consequences. Margaret scanned her employment documents carefully, knowing that David would eventually review them, but hoping that his focus would be on compliance rather than verification. She was nearly finished when she noticed something that made her stomach drop. At the bottom of her employment application, in a section labeled Emergency Contact, was a phone number she recognized. It belonged to a CIA communications center that had been shut down in 2011. The number itself was meaningless now, but if someone with the right knowledge ran it through certain databases, it would reveal connections that Margaret Chen, the librarian, was supposed to have never had. Margaret stared at the document for a long moment, calculating risks and options. She could alter the file. Her scanner was capable of producing documents that looked authentic, but any change would create inconsistencies between the original and the digital copy. She could claim the document was damaged and unscannable, but that would only delay the inevitable. In the end, she decided to trust in the principle that had kept her safe for 15 years. Most people don't look for things they're not expecting to find. Margaret scanned the document exactly as it was and moved on to the next file. David Kim spent his Friday afternoon reviewing the digitized personnel files, checking Margaret's work and organizing them into the new database system. He was impressed by her thoroughness. Every page was perfectly aligned, every scan was crisp and readable, and she had even added helpful metadata tags to make searching easier. When David reached Margaret's file, he reviewed it with the same cursory attention he gave to all employee records. Education, check. References, check. Background verification, check. Everything seemed standard until he noticed the previous employer listed on her application: Educational Resources International. David had never heard of the company, which wasn't unusual. Consulting firms came and went, and Margaret's application was from 2009. But something about the name seemed generic in a way that triggered his instincts. As someone who had written his master's thesis on information literacy in the digital age, David had developed a sensitivity to sources that seemed too perfect, too neat. On impulse, he opened a web browser and searched for Educational Resources International. The results were puzzling. There were no corporate websites, no business listings, no mentions in education industry publications. A few scattered references appeared in academic footnotes and conference programs, but nothing that suggested ERI had been a substantial company with the kind of resources necessary to employ someone for the 6 years Margaret claimed to have worked there. David tried variations of the search: Educational Resources International Consulting, ERI Curriculum Development, Educational Resources International Washington, D.C. Nothing. It was as if the company had never existed, or had been carefully scrubbed from the internet. Most people would have assumed that ERI was simply a small company that had closed without leaving much digital footprint. But David's academic training had taught him to verify sources, and his librarian instincts told him that legitimate businesses, even failed ones, usually left more traces than this. David spent the weekend thinking about what he had discovered, if anything. Monday morning, he decided to ask Margaret about it directly. He found her at the reference desk, helping an elderly patron locate genealogy resources. Margaret's approach to patron assistance was characteristic: thorough, patient, and remarkably knowledgeable about obscure research techniques. She seemed to know exactly which databases would be most useful, which search terms would yield the best results, and how to navigate bureaucratic systems that intimidated most people. After the patron left, David approached her desk. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I was reviewing the personnel files you scanned, and I noticed your previous employer was Educational Resources International. I couldn't find much information about them online. What kind of work did you do there?" Margaret's hands, which had been typing on her keyboard, paused for just a fraction of a second. Her expression didn't change, but David noticed that she seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "ERI was a small consulting firm," she said in her soft voice. "We developed educational materials for international schools, helped organizations improve their research capabilities. It wasn't the kind of company that maintained a large public profile." David nodded. "What happened to them? Did they close?" "The company was restructured in 2009, Margaret replied. "Management decided to focus on different markets. Several of us were laid off, which is why I transitioned to library work." Her explanation was plausible, but David noticed that she had answered his questions without actually providing much information. ERI was small and didn't maintain a large public profile. But what exactly had they done? They developed educational materials and helped organizations improve research capabilities. But what did that mean in practice? David realized he was probably overthinking the situation. Margaret was an exemplary employee, and her past work experience, whatever it had involved, had clearly prepared her well for library science. Still, something about the conversation left him with more questions than answers. That afternoon, David found himself paying closer attention to Margaret's work habits. He noticed things he had previously taken for granted: her encyclopedic knowledge of information sources, her ability to locate obscure documents that other librarians couldn't find, her skill at conducting research that seemed to require understanding of government procedures and international organizations. When a patron asked for help finding records related to a family member who had worked for the State Department in the 1980s, Margaret not only knew exactly which archives to search, but also seemed familiar with the bureaucratic processes involved in declassifying federal documents. When a graduate student needed assistance with a thesis on international development programs, Margaret recommended sources that weren't in any standard bibliography. Sources that suggested deep familiarity with how NGOs and government agencies actually operated overseas. David began to wonder if Margaret's background was more complex than her personnel file suggested. His opportunity to learn more came the following week, when the library received a visit from Dr. James Harrison, a retired professor from the local university who was researching a book about Cold War intelligence operations. Dr. Harrison was looking for declassified documents related to CIA activities in Southeast Asia during the 1970s and 1980s. David would normally have directed such a request to Margaret. She was the library's specialist in government documents and historical research, but he decided to handle it himself, curious to see how a typical reference interaction would unfold. After 20 minutes of searching standard databases and coming up with limited results, David had to admit defeat. Dr. Harrison's request required the kind of specialized knowledge that David simply didn't possess. "Let me get my colleague Margaret," David said. "She's much better at this kind of research than I am." Margaret approached Dr. Harrison's table with her usual quiet professionalism, but David noticed that she seemed to be assessing the older man more carefully than she typically did with patrons. "Dr. Harrison, I understand you're researching intelligence operations in Southeast Asia," Margaret said. "What specific time period and geographic areas are you focusing on?" "Primarily Thailand and Malaysia, 1975 to 1985, Dr. Harrison replied. "I'm particularly interested in operations that involved cooperation between CIA personnel and local educational institutions." David watched Margaret's face carefully, looking for any reaction to the mention of CIA and educational institutions. He thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "Those records can be challenging to locate," Margaret said. "Many documents from that period remain classified, and those that have been released are often heavily redacted. However, there are several approaches we can try." What followed was a masterclass in intelligence research. Margaret didn't just know which databases to search. She understood the classification systems, the bureaucratic processes that determined what information was released and when, and the relationships between different government agencies that affected document availability. She guided Dr. Harrison through resources that David had never heard of: academic papers by former intelligence officers, oral history projects conducted by universities, foreign government documents that had been translated and archived by American institutions. She seemed to know which questions to ask to narrow down his search, which keywords would be most effective, and how to cross-reference different types of sources. Most remarkably, Margaret appeared to understand the operational context behind the documents Dr. Harrison was seeking. She didn't just help him find references to CIA activities in Thailand. She helped him understand how those activities fit into broader strategic objectives, how they related to other operations in the region, and why certain information would or wouldn't appear in official records. After 2 hours of research, Dr. Harrison had enough material to begin writing his book. As he prepared to leave, he turned to Margaret with obvious admiration. "I have to say, you have an exceptional understanding of intelligence operations for a librarian. Have you done academic work in this area?" Margaret's response was characteristically modest. "I've always been interested in government history. You develop familiarity with these topics over time." Dr. Harrison nodded, but David could see that the older man was impressed by more than just academic interest. Margaret's knowledge seemed practical, detailed, and current in ways that suggested direct experience rather than scholarly study. After Dr. Harrison left, David decided to test his growing suspicions. "That was incredible, Margaret. I had no idea you knew so much about intelligence history. Where did you develop that expertise?" Margaret began clearing the research materials from the table, her movements efficient and unrevealing. "You encounter a lot of different subjects in reference work," she said. "Government documents, military history, international relations. It all becomes familiar after a while." David nodded, but he was becoming increasingly certain that Margaret's familiarity with these subjects wasn't just academic. The way she had navigated classified document systems, her understanding of operational procedures, her knowledge of bureaucratic processes, all of it suggested someone who had worked within the intelligence community rather than someone who had simply studied it. That evening, David found himself researching Margaret Chen more thoroughly than he had ever researched any employee. A search of academic databases revealed no scholarly publications, no conference presentations, no evidence of the kind of research activity that would explain her expertise in intelligence history. A search of news archives produced nothing. A search of professional library associations showed that Margaret was a member in good standing, but had never served on committees, presented papers, or received recognition awards. It was as if Margaret Chen had appeared fully formed in 2009, with perfect credentials and impressive skills, but no documented history of developing those credentials or skills. David tried searching for Margaret Chen in combination with Educational Resources International, but found nothing. He tried variations of her name, different spellings, different combinations, all with the same result. Finally, David tried something that felt like a violation of privacy, but which his curiosity made irresistible. He searched for Educational Resources International in combination with terms like CIA, intelligence, and front company. What he found made him realize that his suspicions had been entirely justified. Several academic papers and news articles from the 1990s and early 2000s mentioned Educational Resources International as one of many businesses that had served as covers for CIA operations overseas. The company had been legitimate in the sense that it actually developed educational materials, but its primary function had been to provide plausible employment histories for intelligence officers working under non-official cover. According to the sources David found, ERI had been shut down in 2009 as part of a broader reorganization of CIA cover arrangements. Employees with legitimate backgrounds had been transferred to other positions. Employees whose true work had been classified had been given assistance in transitioning to new careers. David stared at his computer screen, processing the implications of what he had discovered. Margaret Chen, the quiet librarian who never raised her voice above a whisper, had almost certainly been a CIA intelligence officer. The realization explained everything: her research skills, her knowledge of government operations, her ability to navigate classified document systems, her familiarity with international organizations and bureaucratic procedures. It also explained the perfect credentials that seemed to have no traceable origin and the employment history that couldn't be verified. David faced a decision that he wasn't prepared to make. Margaret was an exemplary employee who had served the library faithfully for 15 years. Her past work, whatever it had involved, was clearly classified and had presumably ended when she took the librarian position. She had built a new life, found a new career, and contributed significantly to the community. But David also knew that employing someone under false pretenses, even excellent false pretenses, created potential legal and ethical issues for the library. If Margaret's background became public knowledge, it could reflect poorly on the institution and on David's own judgment as director. David spent the weekend wrestling with what to do. By Monday morning, he had decided to confront Margaret directly, but carefully. He found her in the basement archives, working on the final phase of the digitization project. Margaret was alone, surrounded by filing cabinets and scanning equipment, methodically converting decades of paper records into digital files. "Margaret, I need to talk to you about something," David said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet basement. Margaret looked up from the scanner, her expression neutral but alert. David noticed that she had positioned herself so that she could see both the stairway entrance and the emergency exit, a detail that suddenly seemed significant. "Of course, David. What can I help you with?" David took a breath, knowing that his next words would change their professional relationship forever. "I've been researching Educational Resources International," he said. "I know what it was." Margaret's hands, which had been feeding documents into the scanner, became completely still. For a long moment she didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. When she finally responded, her voice was even quieter than usual. "What do you think you know?" David felt the weight of that question. Margaret wasn't denying anything, but she wasn't confirming anything either. She was assessing him, trying to determine how much he had learned and what he intended to do with that knowledge. "I know that ERI was a CIA front company," David said. "I know it was shut down in 2009, and I know that means your employment history isn't what it appears to be." Margaret studied him for what felt like a very long time. David had the uncomfortable feeling that she was evaluating him as a potential threat, weighing options he couldn't imagine. Finally, Margaret spoke, and for the first time since David had known her, her voice carried an undertone of authority that reminded him that quiet people weren't necessarily powerless people. "David, I need you to understand something very clearly. My work before 2009 is classified at levels that will never be declassified in our lifetimes. I cannot discuss it, confirm it, or acknowledge it in any way that would satisfy your curiosity. What I can tell you is that my transition to library work was arranged through proper channels, that my credentials are legitimate, and that I have never done anything that would compromise this institution or the people it serves." David felt a chill at the change in Margaret's tone. This wasn't the soft-spoken librarian he had worked with for months. This was someone accustomed to dealing with information that could affect national security. "I'm not trying to cause problems," David said quickly. "I just need to understand what I'm dealing with as director." Margaret's expression softened slightly, but the authority remained in her voice. "What you're dealing with, David, is an employee who takes her work seriously, who protects the people she serves, and who values the sanctuary that libraries provide. Nothing else should matter." David realized that Margaret had just told him everything and nothing. She had confirmed his suspicions without actually admitting anything, and she had made it clear that further questions would not be welcome. "I understand," David said, "and I want you to know that as far as I'm concerned, your work here speaks for itself." Margaret nodded, and some of the tension left her posture. "Thank you, David. I appreciate your discretion." As David turned to leave, Margaret spoke again. "David, the work I did before, it was about protecting people. The work I do now is also about protecting people. Different methods, same mission." David paused at the foot of the stairs, struck by the simple dignity in Margaret's words. When he looked back, she had already returned to scanning documents, her movements once again quiet and efficient. But David now understood that Margaret Chen's quietness wasn't about being unassuming. It was about being professional. Over the following months, David found himself seeing the library and Margaret's role in it with new eyes. He noticed how she handled patrons who seemed agitated or potentially dangerous, always calm, always in control, always able to diffuse situations before they escalated. He observed her interactions with law enforcement officers who came to the library on official business, noting that they seemed to treat her with more respect than they typically showed civilian employees. Most significantly, David began to appreciate the kind of sanctuary that Margaret provided to library patrons. People came to her with sensitive questions, embarrassing research needs, and personal problems that required discretion. Margaret handled all of these interactions with the same quiet professionalism, never judging, never gossiping, always protecting the privacy of those who trusted her. David realized that Margaret's intelligence background hadn't prepared her just for gathering information. It had prepared her for protecting it. The revelation of Margaret's past also helped David understand why she had never sought advancement within the library system. She could easily have applied for director positions at larger institutions, could have pursued administrative roles that would have offered higher salaries and greater recognition. Instead, she had remained content with her reference desk, helping individual patrons with their research needs. David began to suspect that Margaret preferred work that allowed her to help people directly, personally, quietly. After years of operating in a world where success was measured by objectives that couldn't be publicly acknowledged, perhaps she found satisfaction in work where the impact was immediate and visible. A patron finding the information they needed, a student completing their research, a community member discovering resources they didn't know existed. 6 months after their conversation in the basement, David faced a budget crisis that threatened to eliminate several library positions. Margaret's job was secure. Her performance evaluations were exemplary, and her specialized skills made her irreplaceable. But David knew that she would be deeply affected by any reduction in library services. During a staff meeting about the budget situation, Margaret raised her hand, something she rarely did in group settings. "I'd like to propose something," she said in her characteristic whisper. "What if we developed new programs that could generate revenue while serving community needs? I have some ideas for research services, document digitization, and information literacy training that could be offered to local businesses and organizations." David was intrigued. "What kind of services?" Margaret's response revealed depths of knowledge that went far beyond traditional library science. Many small businesses need help with regulatory compliance research, competitive intelligence, and grant application preparation. We could offer consulting services that leverage our information expertise. We could also partner with local colleges to provide specialized research training for graduate students. Margaret's proposals were sophisticated, practical, and clearly informed by understanding of how organizations actually used information in decision-making processes. David realized that she was drawing on professional experience that most librarians simply didn't possess. The programs Margaret proposed were implemented over the following year and proved remarkably successful. Local businesses discovered that the library could provide research services that would have cost thousands of dollars from private consulting firms. Graduate students found that Margaret's training programs prepared them for research challenges they encountered in their academic and professional careers. Most importantly, the revenue from these programs allowed the library to avoid layoffs and actually expand some services. David often found himself wondering about the operations Margaret had been involved in during her intelligence career, about the skills she had developed, about the knowledge she carried. But he had learned not to ask questions that wouldn't be answered. Instead, he focused on appreciating what Margaret brought to her current work. Extraordinary competence, absolute discretion, and genuine commitment to helping people access the information they needed. One evening, as David was preparing to leave the library, he found Margaret still at her desk, helping a patron who seemed distressed. The young woman was crying quietly, while Margaret spoke to her in soothing tones, providing tissues and what appeared to be information about domestic violence resources. David watched from a distance, struck by the gentleness with which Margaret handled the situation. There was nothing in her manner that suggested she had ever been involved in activities that required violence or deception. She seemed genuinely dedicated to providing sanctuary to anyone who needed it. After the patron left, David approached Margaret's desk. "Is she going to be okay?" Margaret looked up from the resource list she was preparing. "I hope so. She has options now. Sometimes that's all people need, to know they have options." David nodded, understanding that Margaret was talking about more than just the immediate situation. "You're very good at this work," he said. Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that acknowledged years of experience helping people in difficult circumstances. "Thank you, David. I've had good training." As David locked up the library that night, he reflected on what he had learned about Margaret Chen over the past year. She was undoubtedly one of the most capable people he had ever worked with, someone whose skills and experience were far beyond what her job title suggested. But more importantly, Margaret was someone who had chosen to use extraordinary capabilities in service of ordinary kindness. Whatever she had done in her previous career, she now dedicated her skills to helping people find information, solve problems, and access resources that improved their lives. David had never learned Margaret's CIA code name, had never discovered the details of her classified work, had never found out exactly what operations she had been involved in during her intelligence career. But he had learned something more important. Margaret Chen was someone who understood that the most important work often happened quietly, that the greatest service was often provided without recognition, and that true strength was measured not by the power to destroy, but by the commitment to protect and nurture. In a world that often celebrated loud achievements and public recognition, Margaret Chen represented something different. The quiet professional who found satisfaction in work well done, problems solved, and people helped. Her whispered voice had become a symbol of the sanctuary that libraries provided, and her gentle competence had touched countless lives in ways that would never be measured or acknowledged. Margaret Chen had spent years working in shadows to protect national security. Now she worked in the gentle lighting of the reference section to protect something equally important, the right of every person to access information, to learn, to grow, and to find help when they needed it. Some heroes carry weapons and work in darkness. Others carry knowledge and work in libraries. But they all share the same commitment to protecting the things that matter most. Have you ever encountered someone like Margaret Chen? Someone whose quiet competence made you wonder about their background, whose depth of knowledge seemed to exceed what their current position required? Tell us in the comments about the hidden experts in your life, the people whose true capabilities might surprise us all. Thank you for watching Real Heroes Stories YT. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and share it with others. We're here to honor the stories of quiet service, the heroes who don't seek recognition, and the extraordinary people who choose to use their gifts in service of ordinary kindness. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, remember, some of the most powerful people in the world are the ones who never need to raise their voices.